Hello, and thank you for joining us on this official launch of the Muni Square Podcast. We are here to talk about the mirroring effect of government, society, and culture. Our conversations will illuminate pressing topics and break down how communities and governments that represent them are impacted by these issues. This podcast flows from a Substack publication we began a little over a month ago to broaden perspectives on public service by bringing in voices of practitioners and scholars from across the globe. Today we are joined by Professor Kincaid, a renowned scholar specializing in federalism. In our conversation, we'll address fundamental questions about federalism in the United States today. What makes an issue constitutional? Who decides these questions? How might recent executive actions in immigration, deportation, and funding impact local governments? And what are the potential consequences for our economy, higher education, and international relationships? This is an informed, enlightened conversation that brings clarity to how federalism works in the U.S. today, particularly as we navigate polarization and uncertainty. I invite you to sit back and enjoy the reward of insights that bring clarity to how federalism works, in this instance in the U.S. today, but in future conversations, I hope Professor Kincaid will return to help us with a comparative exploration of federalism around the globe. Check out the show notes, subscribe to MuniSquare on Substack, and if you are an aspiring public leader, you could do no better than learn from the professionals who contribute to the Pioneering Change Community newsletter and podcast. So check out that too, either from the link in Substack or on any of your favorite streaming platforms. So let's get started. John, you're with us today because you are a renowned scholar specializing in federalism. And our discussion today is going to focus on some of the current dynamics in federalism, highlighting some of the constitutional challenges, polarization, immigration policies, and international relations affecting local governments. And I want to begin by just a definition of federalism as I understand it, representing maybe for listeners what is needed as a basic place to start. Federalism within the context of the United States, at least, establishes the relationship between the national government and the 50 states, allowing both to exercise authority within their respective spheres while preserving local autonomy and regional diversity. If you could take that definition for us just a little further to get us started today in our discussion about federalism and why this matters to us and our democracy.
Yes, that's a good definition. Fundamentally, it's a division of sovereignty, which was one of the revolutionary contributions of the founders to political thought and the organization of political societies. People thought sovereignty could not be divided, and that's what they ended up doing. Justice Sandra Day O'Connor put it, they split the atom of sovereignty. And so we have the federal constitution as a result of that. We also have 50 state constitutions, and each constitution is supreme within its sphere of authority. But sort of some relevant to contemporary issues, one of the objectives of federalism is to achieve as much national unity as you can, and by preserving the autonomy of the states, you're also preserving the diversity that exists in a society. The Constitution represented the degree of unity that could be achieved in 1787. What we've seen in recent decades is a nationalization of more political issues on the assumption that we're unified on those questions, when in fact we're not. We're very divided on those kinds of questions. The nationalization of issues that had previously been the domain of the states, particularly cultural issues, has exacerbated the polarization that we've been experiencing in recent years. We still have a lot of diversity in the United States, despite the homogenization that has also occurred in our society since 1787.
Yes, I heard a study recently that might have been conducted by the New York Times. They had a series of questions for people to answer, and they weren't allowed to say up front what party they came from, but the way they answered the questions, they were then told what party they would most align with. I can't remember the percentage, but it was very high. A number of people were shocked at what party interests they were aligned with. We seem to have really muddied the waters of kind of understanding exactly where we are, where we stand on some of these issues that are so important, which makes this conversation even more important today. And I want to move to some of the recent governmental actions. We keep hearing in our news that this raises questions about what is or is not constitutional. And I want to get at what makes something either constitutional or not constitutional. So we might start with an example of a recent court case testing federal authority, and you could walk us through what makes that either constitutional or not constitutional. I could think of deportations as the one that comes to my mind, but you might have a better one that you want to tackle.
In the final analysis, what makes it constitutional is what the Supreme Court says makes it constitutional. The Constitution has some very explicit language about which there can't be much debate. One example of that would be the 2-term limit on the presidency. Despite what Trump is saying, that 2-term limit is very clear. But when it comes to deportation or a whole variety of other issues, economic regulation, tariffs, and so on, the Constitution is much more ambiguous, particularly when it comes to a presidency. The key clauses of the presidency, Article 2, are that the executive power is vested in the President of the United States. The framers didn't know what that meant when they put it in the Constitution. There was no historical precedent for this office. Everybody knew George Washington would be the first president, so they said, let George figure it out. And he did set a lot of precedents. The Constitution also says the president shall take care to execute the laws faithfully and designates the president as commander-in-chief. So those are very broad, ambiguous phrases. And so in the end, it's the court that ends up having to define the limits of that. So certainly what we're seeing with Trump is that he's pushing the boundaries of executive power much farther than any previous president, and that's generating all the court cases that we are seeing. Trump's view is what's called the unitary presidency. His argument is that the first clause, vesting the executive power in the president, means that the president has total authority over the entire executive branch. And that includes the authority of the president to hire and fire people. The president would argue that he has the authority to reorganize departments, like cabinet departments. The president is arguing he has the authority to fire members of independent regulatory agencies because those independent regulatory agencies are essentially unconstitutional. They take away from the president's executive power. So these are all matters of interpretation. And one of the reasons Trump can engage in these activities is that presidents in the course of our history have broadened their power very considerably. It really depends on Congress to rein that in, or the courts, since Congress is not doing that. And Congress does that both with Democratic and Republican presidents. It gets away with more than he otherwise would. And now we're seeing with a Republican president in office, the Republicans in Congress are not willing to buck the president. So that really leaves the courts as the last resort check and balance in the system.
I want to think of 2 examples that we talked about in our previous conversation leading up to today. One is funding, which rests on Congress being able to say, this was established by Congress. You cannot just simply change what we established. And you can say that more clearly. I also see this other issue around deportation. What is discussed is due process, that it could be the worst a criminal, but if you deny due process, you are essentially affecting our own, you and me, our due process rights. In that case, the courts are looking at whether due process was at stake here with the deportations. And is that constitutional? So those are 2 things that I'm not sure. Do they belong in the conversation about what's constitutional, Or do you just say this is an issue for the court to look at and this other one's an issue for Congress to look at?
You're right that the power of the purse belongs to Congress. So these funding issues are really congressional issues. But again, the president is testing the constitutional boundaries here by refusing to spend funds that have been appropriated by the Congress. We do have a statute, the Budget and Empowerment Control Act, 1974, enacted by Congress in response to President Nixon's efforts not to spend money appropriated by Congress. The president is trying to cut off a lot of funding that goes to state and local governments. So we're looking at potential reductions or eliminations of funding for public schools, maybe the community development block grant program, a variety of other programs that local governments rely on. For small local governments, a federal grant of $50,000 is a lot of money for their budget. They have a budget of about $1 million or so, and $50,000 is a lot of money to lose. For bigger cities, you're talking about losing hundreds of millions of dollars, both school districts and municipal governments. That's part of what's being contested now in the courts. Some courts have already ruled that these funds must be expended because they were appropriated by Congress. So I think the president's going to end up losing on most of those things, but that's not to say that's not going to cause a lot of disruption in the short term. Regarding deportations, there are certainly due process issues here, but these are very muddied by the president's foreign policy powers. And the courts have always given the president a wide berth on foreign policy. The courts don't see it as their role to be interfering with this. A lot of shoes are yet to drop in the courts on these deportation issues, on just how far the president can go. President Trump has invoked the Alien Enemies Act of 1798, and that's part of what was originally the infamous Alien and Sedition Acts when John Adams was president. Interestingly, when I talk about the Alien and Sedition Acts, I point out to my students that some of those acts were repealed, but not the Alien Enemies Act. I always said that's a moot point, and now the president invoked that act, so that was quite surprising. So again, what are the due process rights of a foreign national who is in the United States on various types of visas? Still very muddy and ambiguous, and that has yet to be worked out fully by the courts.
So we see a lot of uncertainty that is, if anything, going to have a chilling effect on a lot of local governments who might be used to having some supply of legal immigrant sort of flowing through their economies at a local level. I guess I want to first touch on what a constitutional crisis might look like. I don't know if the immigration issue is a good example, or if you can think of a better one, but if a state, either a governor or at a city level, simply refuse to follow through with orders by the federal authority to gather up immigrants, does this constitute a crisis for our Constitution?
Potentially. We haven't gotten to that point yet. The administration is suing the state of Illinois and Chicago over this very issue, and trying to argue the city and the state are obstructing the federal government's ability to apprehend and deport people. What the constitutional situation is from the perspective of the Supreme Court is that state and local governments have no obligation to enforce federal law. So the president cannot order the governor or a sheriff or a local police chief to round up undocumented immigrants on behalf of ICE. They have no obligation to do that. And that's a decision that goes back to the 1840s when the court ruled that state and local governments have no obligation to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act. That's a job of the federal government. The same thing applies to these deportations. What the Trump administration is trying to argue in its case is that non-cooperation is actually obstruction of federal activity. And I don't think the court's going to buy that. That's litigation that's just now beginning. So it's going to be a year or more before we get a judicial resolution of that. State and local officials are under no obligation to assist ICE in these deportations.
It seems to me that the conversation has, since the election, been very much about criminal behavior, and that there is this sort of unified agreement that we don't want criminals in this country. And that seems very logical, but that obscures the larger issue of what I understand from governors, that there is a desperate need for the labor we have within the weave of our society, whether it's seasonal migrant workers or workers that come up to fill areas of labor that are otherwise not filled by people, Americans in our country. So we have this vast need, and just the flow in and out of the country. I'm working on another podcast about port cities, and you think about ships coming in and the trade that occurs and the tourism that occurs in the ports. What impact, and I would say even unintended consequences, are going to come out of this uncertainty about what exactly are we talking about. If we're not just talking about criminals, which is one thing, but we're just talking about massive deportation of some unknown group that has some quasi status, legal residence, or they're here legally to work, but it's not clear to me at all. They have not clarified exactly who is permitted to be in this country. And my question to you is how that has become a focal point in this quasi crisis, that it has this chilling effect, and it's impacting local governments. It's impacting, I'm assuming, states as far as their labor force. But we're not really talking so much about that. And we've never really talked openly about how much of our workforce is built off of the immigrant.
That's a good point. Immigrants take many jobs that native-born Americans are not willing to take or are not interested in taking. These immigrant groups have revitalized some downtown areas and communities where they've moved in large numbers, opening up small businesses. They are an important part of the labor supply. What's missing here is a serious discussion of immigration reform. We need a new immigration law that will allow for enough immigrants to come into the country to staff these jobs. We also need immigration for the long term because our fertility rate has dropped below the replacement rate. Immigration is the only way to compensate for that. We need more workers paying into the Social Security system, for example, things like that. And that's going to come from immigrants. So that's the big hole that's not being filled. We did have in the past guest worker programs. The problem with illegal immigration increased tremendously after we ended the guest worker programs. And a number of European countries have guest worker programs. There were abuses in that program, unquestionably. So if it was to be reestablished, it would have to be reestablished with effective controls. But I think you're right about the uncertainty. If you are not in the country illegally, should you open a business? Because you never know what day you might be deported. So that definitely has a negative impact on local economies and a lot of rural economies that depend on these immigrant workers for harvesting crops and so on. So that's an important dimension too.
And what about the colleges and universities? I don't know what at Lafayette, but I'm hearing from colleagues in universities that there is a real chilling effect on students who simply don't want to be stuck either away or here. It's the issue of what's going to happen at the border, which has not been spelled out because they're clear enough about who could be impacted.
And so if you do not have a U.S. passport, you want to be very careful about leaving the country. You might not get back in. If you're a student here on a visa, you face the possibility of being deported. Most institutions are going to provide legal assistance to students who are in that situation. that's one way that the institutions will respond.
It's very interesting to me, and this is maybe veering off in a direction that we don't intend. But again, the consequences of the trade policies, the tariffs that we're talking about, in a utopian sort of ideal world, as Americans, we would say, well, now that I can't import those products from Europe, which I'm used to using, we'll just start a business up in America because now Americans are going to buy American products. They're not going to be able to do it at the cost of labor. The reason why our global economy has worked so well is because we're able to buy goods for less from other countries because of our economy here. So we import from other countries. If we're going to set up shop in this country, we have to change our wage laws. We have to pay people more. I would love to see that happen. I would love to see a raise of the minimum wage. I don't think companies will do that. I think they'll be eager to get somebody back in office that says, let me get that cheap labor in another country rather than have to pay somebody a much higher minimum wage to make that product here. So again, that brings in the whole immigrant issue and also combines our international trade policies. And I guess there's just a lot of pieces to what is happening here when we talk about the flow of immigration in and out of this country and how that intersects with our other policies relative to economics and trade. I wanted to say a little bit more. You just mentioned our economic reliance on immigration within local governments. We do have an economic reliance on that. And let's make sure we've hit on some of the ways that shows up. Again, going back to port cities, I think about tourism. I think we are hearing that in the news of impact on local governments from people not traveling over the borders into their states. In port cities, we have a lot more diversity in terms of who comes into our countries through those ports because they're working on the ships and they have families, they're connected to families here, although they may be from another country. We have within the farming communities so many workers that come over for part of the year to work on those farms with their families. They have maybe established families in this country. They bring their extended families in to help with the farming communities. What am I missing here? I know there's more that's involved in terms of our reliance on immigrants.
Going back to tourism, I think we're going to see a big drop-off in tourism in the United States. So certainly communities, particularly in some of the southern states that voted for Trump, are already seeing a huge drop in Canadian tourists. They're just refusing to come. And you had so many snowbirds coming down south from Canada for the winter, and they're not going to show up. And that's going to have a huge impact on Myrtle Beach, number of communities in Florida, for example. And I think we're going to see a decline in tourism from other countries as well, such as Europe, fewer Europeans, fewer Chinese coming into. Chinese tourism has become very large and particularly impacts the Western states in the part. So this tit-for-tat tariff business is going to reduce Chinese tourism. Tourism is part of the service industry that so many municipalities depend on, and that's going to face serious economic difficulties as a result. We'll see fewer foreign students wanting to come study at universities for these reasons, and that's going to hit the finances of universities very heavily, and because they rely on foreign students for tuition, particularly graduate students. Graduate students are the most lucrative students for universities, and so having much fewer foreign students coming to study in master's and PhD programs, it's going to be a big financial hit on universities, and that's going to have an effect on the municipalities where these universities are located. So there's a lot of chain reaction consequences that are going to flow from this, which again brings me back to we really need to have a clear immigration reform law enacted by Congress that would also cover all these visa issues. And that is not something that's being discussed at the moment.
You put that together really well. And so this leads to a question that I know gets discussed at the local government level. When businesses come to them, and maybe it's local chambers, and they're concerned about the impact at the local level, what I hear you saying is that this really has to get moved up to Congress. I'm not sure whether you might have a clear vision of whether this energy of concern and need to improve the immigration laws, does that start at the state level, or should they be going directly to their Congress representatives to pressure them to address this?
Yeah, well, officials could certainly pressure their elected officials in Congress to address the issue. I'm just not sure that they're going to be willing to do that. And you have some wide disagreements between the two parties over immigration. So any immigration reform law, for example, is going to raise the question of, do we provide a path for citizenship for people who have come into the country illegally? And the Democrats tend to be on the side of saying yes. Republicans tend to answer no, that they need to go back first before they can become citizens. This polarization makes it difficult to pass an immigration reform law. So that's why I'm not very optimistic on that point, to be frank about it. Yeah.
That's unfortunate. Maybe when we meet again, we'll have some other ideas on that. But that it does seem to be very much in flux. I just don't know how it's possible to ignore very long. With the tariffs in place, there's going to be more demand here at home. If we're not going to be importing as much, we're going to need to get busy here. That's going to require a large workforce. It's paid well. If they're not willing to pay decent, they're going to have to find that labor elsewhere. I'd like to talk a little bit more about some of the polarization that is reshaping local government and why this might be creating problems for society. We have local governments who traditionally are focused on infrastructure and reliability of services, whether it's sewer, water, roads. We see issues that are very partisan coming up at the local level. And you mentioned in our previous conversations, school board elections and city councils influenced by ideological platforms. How is this going to impact us overall as we deal with the uncertainty of our time right now?
Yeah, it will create more uncertainty. We'll see the kind of policy whiplashes in state and local governments that we see already in the federal government. As the Congress and the White House change parties, you have whiplash effect and you have a totally different set of policies. So you have the president eliminating what the previous president did and moving in a different direction, Congress the same way. So political scientists talk about the nationalization of state and local politics. And increasingly, voters are voting for state and local officials based on their national party orientations. And we saw this in spades with the Wisconsin Supreme Court election. That was officially a nonpartisan election, but it was highly partisan. Everybody knew who was actually the Democratic and Republican candidates. All this out-of-state money poured in from George Soros for the Democratic candidate, Elon Musk for the Republican candidate. It's really a paradigmatic example of the nationalization of state politics. Voters came out to vote for that Supreme Court justice seat. Democrats were voting against Trump, and Republicans were voting for Trump for that seat. And we're also beginning to see a similar thing in local government. It's a little more advanced in school board elections because schools touch on some of these volatile issues over which we're polarized, such as transgender rights, pronouns, what kinds of books we can have in the library, notions of critical race theory, conflicts over what's in the curriculum. That has made school board elections in many communities much more polarized than they ever were in the past. We moved to nonpartisanship in local governments and city manager form of government, because the assumption was that there's no Democratic or Republican way to put out a fire. But increasingly, you see people running for city council seats who are bringing a national political agenda to the city council, even though that may be totally inappropriate. They have no idea what a municipal government does, so they're not really interested in delivering services as much as they are in delivering some kind of ideological message. So this kind of nationalization is unfortunately beginning to seep into local governments as well.
I wonder how you find perspective from your understanding of history. Where do you find comfort in history that says, we've been through this, we can also weather this?
A lot of what's happening today feels to me like what happened before the Civil War. We had the nationalization of the issue of slavery, and so that's a cultural kind of issue. People felt very strongly on both sides, and you had diehard defenders and opponents of slavery, and that issue could not be resolved without a war. Now, I'm not saying we're necessarily headed toward a similar type of civil war, but we could be headed toward a kind of de facto civil war in which things are very dysfunctional. It's very hard to get anything done. You have states splitting in different directions. So the Republican states will be pursuing their policies. The Democratic states will be pursuing their policies. We will have gridlock in Congress, presidents pursuing increasingly aggressive policies. So if a Democrat succeeds Donald Trump, that person is going to be about as aggressive as Trump, just in the opposite direction with different policies. So it's not like the New Deal period where we faced the Great Recession and people were able to, in that case, it was the Democratic Party that was able to assemble this coalition that was able to endure and govern until 1968. And so we didn't have a revolution. We didn't have violent conflict as a result of that. But those were economic issues. The difference is that we have a whole host of cultural issues that got introduced into national politics in the 1960s. And that's part of what destroyed the New Deal coalition. I wish I could be more optimistic. I'm just not.
My biggest concern is the long-term damage to the relationships internationally. I don't know whether you share that perspective, that the loss of those relationships are going to have a much longer impact. I suppose if I were to try to find that silver lining, I would say good for the European Union if they're coming together and finding cohesiveness. We hopefully will do the same in our own country, with Canada, with Mexico, and rebuild. I don't know how that rebuilding is going to happen, but I just fear most that we are going to lose some of our international diplomacy that has been so vital to security.
Yeah, the rest of the world faces the same uncertainty that we do. The European Union, Canada, Mexico, they're in a situation where they never know when the voters are going to elect someone like President Trump again. They cannot rely on voters approving more centrist candidates. So that's what they're going to be thinking about. And the next generation of leaders in foreign countries are going to be acting with that uncertainty in mind, knowing very well. And this is especially evident in Canada and Mexico because Trump negotiated the new U.S., Canada, Mexico trade agreement that replaced NAFTA during his first administration. Now, his second administration breaking that agreement. And so no rational leader of Canada and Mexico for the next 100 years can sit back and say, oh, we have a new trade agreement. They can't. And so they're always going to have to act with that kind of uncertainty in mind. And I think that's the reality out there.
Yeah, it is a really tough reality to face right now. And Even a few years ago, people would say, this is the United States. This is never going to happen in the United States. Our Constitution is so strong. We're going to be able to weather this. Today, we've touched on the possibilities of a constitutional crisis. That just adds one more layer of uncertainty. We won't have as much confidence as we did even a few years ago. We'll come out the other side of it, but we may not be the same country. Would you agree with that?
The core problem is that voters have a very low level of trust in all of our government institutions, and they also have lower trust in higher education, the media, so they don't have trustworthy sources of information, and that makes everything suspect. And you have, I think it's exacerbated by social media. People isolate themselves in echo chambers. People just pay attention to the media that supports their point of view, and that further isolates everyone. And so it's a big, that's the kind of the underlying problem, is the lack of trust and confidence. Now, people do have more trust and confidence in state and local governments, so that may give room for state and local governments to take more action. But again, we have our states polarizing between red and blue states. Republicans and Republican states have a lot of trust and confidence in their state and local governments. Same for Democrats and Democratic states. So it doesn't mean their states are going to move in a bipartisan direction. And it's hard to know how to rebuild that trust. Once that trust is lost, it's like a personal relationship. Once a friend of yours does something shocking and you lose trust in that friend, it's very hard to recover that trust. Same way with government and institutions.
Yeah, I feel the same way. And I do think those of us who have been around for enough decades can reflect on this and really reflect on the importance of it. I think there's a lot of work to do here. And I really hope you'll come back again as these issues emerge and unfold. John, you've contributed a wonderful article to MuniSquare on Substack, and maybe there'll be some other inspiration that you'd like to offer us. But we're just getting started on some of these dialogues, and there might even be another episode that we can talk about federalism with some of the other participants from other countries, just to give it some comparison and how that differs from country to country and how they experience it. I think it's interesting to get their perspective. Those who are in Denmark, for instance, we have somebody, Krista in Denmark. I'd like to know what's she thinking. That was a question I didn't ask you. This is a naive question. Is taking over Greenland constitutional, or is that something that an executive office is privy to do?
Vance's trip was perfectly constitutional. It might not have been politically advisable from the point of view of trying to warm the hearts of the residents of Greenland, but the president would have the authority, presumably, to purchase Greenland, just like Jefferson executed the Louisiana Purchase. Questionably constitutional when it happened. Prosecuting a war to acquire invading Greenland would be really unpopular within the United States and catastrophically unpopular with the rest of the world. So that would be a very inadvisable move. But it is interesting that President Trump acquired from Congress on loan a portrait of President James K. Polk, and he has that prominently displayed in the Oval Office. Polk is the president that acquired more than 1 million square miles of territory for the United States during his one term in office. Following the Mexican War, acquired all that land that now includes New Mexico, Arizona, California, and so on. The Oregon Territory includes a number of states. So Trump is very much an admirer of Polk, and I think he wants to beat Polk's record. To do that, he needs not only Greenland, but also Canada. Who knows what's going to happen?
The idea of taking over Canada just sounds like a madman. It is so far beyond my comprehension that he would even entertain that at some serious level, which makes me wonder, is it just a distraction? But again, that's just something else we have to circulate in our brain to figure out what is going on. We'll see what evolves. And maybe there'll be another time that you'll come back, talk to us again, and maybe extend the conversation if that works for you.
Thank you for the invitation, Nancy. I enjoyed talking with you.
It's so great to have you close by and so able to talk at a level that is, for most of us, just a little mind-boggling when we try to contemplate what's going on day to day.
Maybe we'll have another conversation then.
That'd be great. Thank you so much, John. Take care.
All right. Bye-bye.